My name is David Shayevitz. It's great to see some familiar faces and great to see some unfamiliar faces too that I hope I'll have a chance to meet. Welcome everybody to this year's installment of the Klutznick Lecture in Jewish Civilization. I'm a professor of Jewish history here at Northwestern and director of the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies, one of the two sponsors of tonight's event. It's really a wonderful opportunity to welcome a fantastic speaker about whom we'll say more in a second, and also to welcome folks to campus. Permit me to say a couple of words about the Crown Family Center for those who are not familiar with the work that we do here. The Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies is an academic hub for undergraduate and graduate education, faculty and student research, and accessible and engaging public programming. Our students, affiliated faculty members, and visiting professors and postdoctoral fellows study, teach, and research Jewish history, Jewish philosophy and thought, Hebrew and Yiddish language and literature, Holocaust studies, and the history, politics, and culture of the State of Israel. The Crown Family Center is comprised of over a dozen affiliated full-time faculty members, a robust group of visiting scholars and postdocs, an undergraduate student major, 2 minors, an interdisciplinary graduate cluster, dozens of annual courses, so there's a lot, thankfully, that we have going on. I'll encourage everybody, if you haven't already, to grab a copy of our annual report that's on the table outside, to sign up for our mailing list, to follow us on social media. We do a lot of programming geared towards the broader public, and it would be wonderful to have a chance to welcome people to more events in the future. On that last point, so there's a lot of different centers and programs at Northwestern, and one of the things that makes the Crown Family Center unique really is the quantity and also the quality of programming we do for the community outside of the campus, outside of the Northwestern campus. I think for my colleagues and I, if we confined what it is that we have to offer only to students and only to people who are working here, it would be a real wasted opportunity. And so it's that much more of a great opportunity to have everybody here and to be able to disseminate some of the knowledge and teaching that our students get to have access to on a regular basis. Part of that mission of building bridges with the broader community outside of the university is the longstanding partnership that we have with the Jewish Federation of Metropolitan Chicago, the co-sponsor of tonight's event. In just a moment, I'm going to welcome my friend and colleague Michael Simon onto the stage to speak on behalf of the Federation, but I'll just say for my own part that our partnership with the Federation includes a visiting fellowship in Israel Studies, where we bring young scholars from Israel to teach and research here in Evanston. We work very closely with Northwestern's Hillel, working together to enhance students' classroom experiences and to connect them to their communal lives. And for the past 40 years, we have jointly hosted this Klutznick event, which takes the very best of academic Jewish studies scholarship, tries to present it in ways that are accessible and engaging, and which speak not only to the long history of Jewish civilization, but also to its impact upon the present and future of the Jewish world. And this year's speaker, who we'll say more about in just a moment, I think really exemplifies that bridging of the community and the academic world. But before we introduce him formally, it's a pleasure to call upon my friend Michael Simon to speak on behalf of the Federation.
I'm going to lean in from the beginning. Good evening, everyone. I'm Michael Simon, and I have the privilege of serving as the Executive Director of Northwestern Hillel. It's an honor to welcome you this evening on behalf of both Hillel and the Jewish United Fund, and to be part of this year's Klutznick Lecture. This lecture is a powerful example of what becomes possible through partnership between the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies, JUF, and the broader Northwestern community. Together, these institutions create space for serious learning, for meaningful conversation, and for engagement with the ideas and histories that shape Jewish life and the world around us. At Hillel, we think a lot about what it means to build not only a safe space for students, but also a brave space. One where students are encouraged to ask hard questions, to wrestle with complexity, and to engage deeply with Jewish identity, history, and responsibility. The Klutznick Lecture embodies that same spirit. It brings to campus scholars who challenge us to think more rigorously, to understand more fully, and to connect more meaningfully to our past, present, and future. And tonight's program does exactly that. The story of the movement to free Soviet Jewry is not only a powerful chapter in modern Jewish history, it's also a story about moral courage, collective action, and the capacity of individuals and communities to stand up for human dignity across borders. It's a story that resonates deeply today, reminding us of both the responsibility and the possibilities inherent in engaged citizenship. We're deeply grateful to the Jewish United Fund for its enduring partnership and vision in supporting programs like this, and to the Crown Family Center for their leadership in bringing Jewish scholarship and conversation to life here on this campus. It's a particular pleasure to work on programs and initiatives throughout the year with my friend David Shiavitz and his terrific colleagues at the Crown Family Center. Thank you all for being here, and now David will introduce Shaul Kelner.
Okay, thank you, Michael. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Shaul Kelner, who is Professor of Jewish Studies and Sociology at Vanderbilt University. Shaul is a researcher whose work focuses on trans-regional Jewish solidarity and the intersection of culture and politics in Jewish life. He's the author of 2 books. His first book, Tours That Bind, Diaspora Pilgrimage and Israeli Birthright Tourism, which came out in 2010, won the Association for Jewish Studies inaugural Jordan Schnitzer Book Award and received an honorable mention for the American Sociological Association's Mary Douglas Prize for Best Book. And his newest book, which came out in 2024, A Cold War Exodus, How American Activists Mobilized to Free Soviet Jewry, was written with support from the National Endowment of the Humanities and won a National Jewish Book Award. We're going to be hearing a little snippet from that project in just a moment. I won't waste everybody's time. It wouldn't be a waste, but I won't take everybody's time with the many, many honorifics that Professor Kelner brings as a visiting scholar, as an author, as an award-winning teacher at Vanderbilt. But I will just add on a brief coda to the introduction, which is to say that it's rare, unfortunately all too rare, to find scholars of Jewish studies, university professors, who also are able to take their research, to take their academic findings and translate them for the broader public, and to really shape in a decisive way the communal conversations that are happening beyond the university campus in the Jewish community, with some of the sort of major issues surrounding activism and Israeli connections with diaspora Jewry, the things that are such important topics for all of us in the Jewish community and in the world at large today. And Professor Kelner is really somebody, a public intellectual, who is able to take his specialized learning and intervene in really decisive and important and influential ways beyond the campus. And so he's a particularly fitting choice, I think, to offer the Klutznick Lecture this year. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome him to the stage. Professor Kelner.
Thank you, David. And since my mom's friends are here, really, thank you, David. I also, where's Katie? Is Katie here? Oh, okay, well, I want to thank Katie because she did all the logistics for this to make this happen. Thank you also to the university, the Crown Family Center, and to the JUF for this. So we're going to be talking about something that some of you, a lot of you might already know a lot about. Some of you, this might be new. And for those of you who had been involved in activism to free Soviet Jews, hopefully I'll be able to give you some insight into an aspect of what you lived, but in a different way. And where I get it wrong, I'm sure that you'll tell me. For those of you who were in the Soviet Union and were the other side of this, you may or may not have known how much activity there was in the States. It really was the largest American Jewish social movement of all time. And it's something that for the generation of Americans who lived through it, it was meaningful. I would say it was monumental. But for the generation that came after, and I teach about activism to free Soviet Jews to undergraduates, and by and large, the story has not been told, and the history and the memory has not really been passed along. And so part of what I was hoping to do with the book, A Cold War Exodus, was to memorialize and also honor the regular people here in the States who made this activist movement happen, and not just the famous names, Natan, Anatoly Sharansky, and the like, but people who were working in almost every community in the States, often, usually out of their kitchens and their living rooms, whose names generally have not been recorded. And I wanted to record that to honor the work that they did and to also give us and future generations an ability to learn some of the lessons of activism and how basically citizens in the United States managed during the Cold War to pressure a superpower, the rival superpower, to change its policy. It's impossible to do, and they did it. And so what I'm going to speak with you about today will be part of the general strategy about how activists actually made this happen, but with a local angle. So for those of you who were living here in the Chicago area back in the 1970s and 1980s, there may be names that will be familiar. If I say your name and you're here, please stand up and shout. And we'll give a local angle, because everything that was happening in the movement to free Soviet Jews around the country was also happening here in the Chicago area, and so we're going to talk a bit about the local angle. And so I want to start with a feature. This is from 1981. It was in Chicago Magazine. Is Holly Birnbaum in the room? Does anyone know Holly Birnbaum? Yes? Okay, thank you. So there was a feature article about a woman from Highland Park who was 27 years old. She was living in Paris, and she got connected in Paris with a Soviet Jew, an organization that was working to free Soviet Jews. And I'll say a little bit more later about what the specific issue was, what the problems were. But just know at the moment, there's a 27-year-old Chicagoan, Highland Park, living in Paris. It's like Emily in Paris, but it was Holly in Paris. That had a really, really different experience, because she gets connected with an activist group that is going and delivering direct aid to Jews in the Soviet Union. And this organization is led by a guy named, an American who moved over there named David Selikowitz. And they send Holly Birnbaum to the Soviet Union to meet with Jews who had applied to emigrate, were refused permission, and got the name Refusnick because of that, and then were persecuted in various ways for having dared to ask to leave the country. And so she's sent in for about a week at the end of July, beginning of August in 1979. And she is bringing information in. She has questions to ask them to bring information out, legal status, medical conditions, things like that. And she's doing this, and of course, this is something that the Soviet government knows is happening, but is not fond of, and is going to create some problems for any of the travelers who did this. And she was one of tens of thousands of Westerners, Americans, French, Brits, Swedes, Israelis, who would go and deliver this. So there's an article in Chicago Magazine, Holly Birnbaum versus the KGB. And it's published, and the activists here are not happy about the coverage. You might think, wait a second, this is a cover story about the problems that Soviet Jews are facing, a local angle about how someone from the community was able, in 1979, it's expensive. It's difficult to go to the Soviet Union. Not everyone's going. This is elite travel, in a way. This is prestigious travel, and this has a sense of danger about it. And it's being reported, so isn't that good? And I'll read you a little passage, how this began. And as you're listening, try to think about why Holly Birnbaum herself, David Selikowitz, who sent her, and activists from a group here called Chicago Action for Soviet Jewry. Was anyone involved in that? Okay, thank you. Why people were not thrilled with Chicago Magazine for writing the story in the way that they did. Here is Holly Birnbaum, a young woman from Highland Park who did something brave. She was brave in the classic manner of the American innocent abroad. meaning that she got caught up in something much greater than herself, and she was scared throughout. Holly entered the Soviet Union on a mission. She was bringing things in and bringing things out, and the Soviet guards would have confiscated all of it in an instant. For years, a trickle of Westerners have been doing what Holly did. Because of them, we are more aware of dissidents and of refuseniks, Russians persecuted simply because they asked permission to emigrate. Their lives are somewhat more tolerable and hopeful, and perhaps a few more are permitted to leave. When she volunteered for this mission 2 years ago, Holly did not understand all the dangers. Today, she is still not certain what they are. She is sure that she was shadowed by the Soviet secret police, and yet the police never stepped in. Why was the KGB content to watch her? She has no idea. Holly Birnbaum writes a letter. David Solikowicz writes a letter. Chicago Action for Soviet Jewry's Betty Kahn writes a letter. And they're protesting. This cloak and dagger travesty. When activist groups in France, in the States, would send Americans, under the guise of being tourists, to go help refuseniks, they knew that going into the Soviet Union was dangerous, and it was also something that for most people in the West, they could only think about it through the lens of a James Bond movie. And the briefing materials that Chicago Action for Soviet Jewry had created to orient the travelers before they went said, listen, when you come back, and I'll quote, don't make it sound like a James Bond movie. And it was not only Chicago Action for Soviet Jewry, there were local Soviet Jewry groups across the country. They each had their briefing kits, and they all said more or less the same thing. This is not about you. This is not about your sense of adventure. This is not going to have fun and games. You're going to help people in need. And when you come back and you're telling the story, and people are going to be all excited, oh, you went to the Soviet Union, we've only seen things like that in the movies, keep them focused on what this is really about. This is about Soviet Jews who are being denied their rights, who are being ill-treated, and we're doing something to help them. And so the letters of protest are about the way that this was framed. David Solikowicz, afterwards, is reflecting on this, and he says they were actually talking about doing a screenplay. And he was ambivalent about it, because on the one hand, it was a way of getting the story out about what's happening in the Soviet Union. And on the other hand, he knew that the only way that this story was going to be told, if it was being told in a movie, it was going to be a spy movie. And they were weighing whether they actually wanted that, what the trade-offs were. In the end, this movie wasn't made. There was a French movie. There was a movie in France that was made years later called Friends from France, which is a story of two cousins who go. But it has all of the cloak and dagger and the like. And the story, in a sense, writes itself. Okay. I want to step back, and I want you to reflect on the fact that a 27-year-old was able, during the Cold War, to go to the Soviet Union, to leave the official trip. And basically, if you were traveling to the Soviet Union then, you were going on a package tour, the government tourist agency, and they were showing you what they wanted you to see. You actually could go off on your own. You could get in trouble for doing it. She did this. And she was not the only one, and she was able, when most people didn't care, and when most of the people who did care were doing their help from very far away, you have a 27-year-old who's able to go directly, face to face, with people who others have been writing and calling, and she's able to sit down with them around their kitchen table over a cup of tea and offer moral support and practical support. So how does this happen? Because this stuff doesn't just happen. You need some type of organization. You need some type of activist work on the front end to allow something like this to occur. So how did it happen, and what did it mean? So she's going. Why is she going? What is the problem? We'll tell very quickly the problem just from the slogans that activists were using when they were protesting. Let them live as Jews. Can we see if a cursor here? No. Okay. Top left. Let them live as Jews or let them leave. Soviet government had, it was a schizophrenic policy. It was a contradictory policy. On the one hand, there was pressure to deny one's Jewishness, pressure for forced assimilation. You couldn't teach Hebrew. They were not letting people train rabbis. Participation in any religious community, including synagogues, was discouraged. So most of the kids were not having bar mitzvahs. Bat mitzvah was an American thing. It didn't get over to the Soviet Union. 1922, it's created in the United States. But they were not allowed to live Jewishly. And then on the other hand, on their internal documents, nationality was stamped. And nationality could be Russian, or Ukrainian, or Lithuanian, or Georgian, or Yevray. Hebrew, Jew. Okay, so, and this was the fifth line of the document, and it basically created a glass ceiling. You could get so far in certain schools. You could get so far in certain jobs. You could get to the top, but you're going to have to go out to, you'll have to go out to boondocks to do that. But you can't escape your Jewishness, but you can't embrace it at the same time. Okay, so maybe some people will say, well, then you know what? I want to go somewhere else. I want to go somewhere where I don't have to deal with this. I'm Jewish. I want to live Jewishly. I'll go. You apply to emigrate. You could lose your job. You could lose your apartment. If you lose your job, it's illegal to be unemployed because it's a communist country. Everyone needs to work. But now you're unemployed, so you could be arrested. You're upset about this, the way that you're now being persecuted. You decide you're going to protest. And some of the people who protested ended up in prisons or in prison camps because of it. So even trying to change the situation from within escalated, cascaded the problems. And at the same time, the Jewish institutions are being shut down. Synagogues, Jewish theaters, Jewish presses, and the like. That's the situation. And so activists in the States are saying, let them live as Jews or let them leave. I am my brother's keeper. This time, we will not be silent. And the activism starts in the 1960s. You had young baby boomers who were looking at their parents' generation and saying, what were you doing in the 1940s? Did you raise your voice enough? You were not able to stop Hitler. We're not going to be like you. This is partly post-Holocaust trauma, but it's also partly very much American generational politics. All right, you have the baby boomers. We're going to get out on the street, and everyone's protesting. We're going to protest too, and we're not going to be silent this time. And of course, let my people go. This is foundational Jewish narrative, and we're invoking it. Okay, this is the problem. By 1987, the first activists are beginning to create organizations in 1963. 1964. The first group is created in Cleveland, Ohio, and it's a synagogue book club that's founded. And then there's a student group that's founded a little bit later in New York, Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry. And then there's an American Jewish Conference for Soviet Jewry that gets convened in April of '64. That brings together the federations, the heads of the different religious movements, B'nai B'rith, ADL, and the Hadassah, groups like that. 1987, 250,000 people turn out to the National Mall in Washington, D.C. There's a summit. President Reagan, Premier Gorbachev are meeting, and American Jews are there basically to give the president the backing, the ability to say, Mr. Gorbachev, look out the window. This is what I have to deal with. Let their people go. one of the speakers on the dais, who introduced the most famous of the Soviet Jewish refusnik prisoners, Anatoly Natan Sharansky, the person who introduced him was named Pam Cohen, who was the president first of the Chicago Action for Soviet Jewry, and later the umbrella group for all of the local community councils, the Union of Councils for Soviet Jews. Okay, so 250,000 people. It was, until November 2023, the largest rally in American Jewish history. Sharansky, by the way, was involved in organizing both the 87 one and the 2023 one. But people just don't turn out. And in 1963, 64, when the people a small number of activists who knew that there was an issue, who cared and wanted to do something about it, they felt like they were banging their heads against a wall, trying to get any Jewish organization to pay attention to the issue. But 25 years later, they're able to fill that space. And that just doesn't happen. It's not because American Jews automatically cared. Activists had to get people to care. And they worked, and they worked very hard, and that's what we're going to be looking at. Okay, so what were they doing, and how? The goal was to change Kremlin policy. If you're not going to change the policy about how Jews are able to live in the Soviet Union, at least open the gates and let them go. But how, if you're working out of your kitchen in Highland Park, are you going to be able to get the Kremlin to change its policy? That's the dilemma. And so the activists in the States come up with the model. And that model is the only actor that may have the leverage to pressure the Soviet government to change policy is the US government. But the US government in the early 1960s is not interested in taking on the issue of Soviet Jewry. It had other things. One, mainly nuclear arms race. And this is Soviet internal affairs. We're not dealing with this. We have to manage the Cold War. That's the priority. This is just a distraction. Also, early 1960s, if the United States starts pointing to the Soviet Union and saying, you're discriminating against one of your minority populations, okay? So the State Department was not interested in taking this on. So in order to get the government to do something, the activists realized we need to essentially mobilize to put pressure, not on the Soviet government, but on the US government, and on our elected representatives, and the like. And initially they thought, we're just a few people, we're a synagogue book club, we don't have the ability to do this, but B'nai B'rith, the American Jewish Committee, they can do it. Right? The Jewish Federation system, they have the ability. The Conference of Presidents can do something. But they weren't taking it on. So they thought, all right, what we'll do is we'll try to put pressure on these groups. But how do you get the Jewish organizations to move? You got to get Jews to put pressure on their organizations. But most Jews didn't care about it. So the model was rally American Jews to pressure their organizations to pressure the US government to pressure the Kremlin. That's the model of change. They didn't know at the time, in the early 1960s, that there were Jews in the Soviet Union who were also organizing to fight from within. Later, in the 1970s, they discovered each other and they began to work together. And so there were more ways that pressure was being put on. And also, some of the groups got tired of pressuring the large Jewish organizations because they thought they're moving slowly, they have lots of other issues on their plate, they're not necessarily prioritizing freeing Soviet Jewry versus all the other things. What if freeing Soviet Jewry comes into conflict with support for Israel? 1973, all right, this was there with Nixon. Nixon wanted détente. He wanted to keep things cool with the Soviet Union, right? But it's the Yom Kippur War. American Jews want two things. They want US support for Israel. They want active US support to pressure the Kremlin. Nixon has leverage. Be quiet on the Soviet front. You're messing détente, and if you're quiet there, then things will go nicely with arms for Israel. Okay, so the large Jewish organizations had to balance all this. But the activists who said, we're activists for Soviet Jewry, that is what we are doing, to the exclusion of all else. Like, that is our issue. They decided, we're going to create our own groups. We don't need to work through the establishment organizations. We'll just go and work with our own representatives and the like. So the mechanisms for how American Jews put pressure on the US government got a little bit more diverse than activists had originally imagined. The activist groups at the national level were often fighting with each other, and one of the interesting things in doing the research about this and speaking with activists, in addition to fighting against the Soviet Union, it's a factionalized movement. You had a group that called themselves the grassroots, and they wanted to move fast, and they wanted to move hard. And you had a group that called itself the establishment, and they wanted to build consensus, and they wanted to be very careful because they had multiple priorities that they had to balance. The grassroots groups, the Union of Councils, thought that the establishment group, the National Conference, was too slow. The National Conference thought that the Union of Councils were a bunch of mavericks and wouldn't follow discipline. The Israeli government's trying to control things at the same time. Leave that to Q&A if you want. That's the national level. And in some communities, you had multiple organizations. So Jewish United Fund, I didn't have the old logo from the 70s, I couldn't find that. They are working with the National Conference. There's a group of local activists, Chicago Action for Soviet Jewry, and they are part of a union of councils. In Chicago, those of you who were involved will tell me how well the JUF and the Action for Soviet Jewry cooperated. There were some communities where they were always butting heads, and then there were others, like Philadelphia, where the group was a member of both at the same time. And so they were able to serve as bridges. The conflict was a lot worse at the national level than it was at the grassroots level. But what we're going to see here with how the activism played out, you'll see there were things that the Jewish United Fund was doing, and there are things that Chicago Action for Soviet Jewry was doing. Chicago Action for Soviet Jewry becomes a national leader in the movement to free Soviet Jews, in part because of particular people who were leading Chicago Action for Soviet Jewry, who then move up to head. You can see Pamela Braun-Cohen is national president. I don't know if you can see it there, but right at the top of board of directors. So you can see how Chicagoans are actually working at the national level too. And so it helps to establish Chicago as one of the leaders. But for example, so how are we seeing this play out? This is, you're not going to be able to read this. I'll highlight this for you. This is the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency News Bulletin from 1972, April. And in April of 72, Nixon is planning to go to Moscow for a summit. And Soviet Jewry groups think this is a great moment to tell Nixon, put Soviet Jewry on the summit agenda, which he does not want to do because he does not want to threaten détente. So for the very first time, we get a nationwide set of rallies all over the country on one day, and it's called Solidarity Day, Solidarity Sunday. The main one was in New York, but it was all over the country. It's in Chicago too. In Chicago, the Jewish community will hold a mass meeting next Sunday at the Civic Opera House. The event is being sponsored by the Public Affairs Committee of the Jewish United Fund with the cooperation of the Committee on Soviet Jewry of the Community Council of Jewish Organizations. Philip M. Klutznick, right, who this lecture is named for, along with his wife, chairman of the JUF Public Affairs Committee, announced that the Chicago National Solidarity Day observance will culminate in a major campaign to collect signatures on petitions, which will be presented to President Nixon. So 2,500 people turn out to this very first event here in Chicago, and it becomes an annual event. So JUF is involved, and Chicago Action for Soviet Jewry is very involved. And what you're seeing here is the opening of a folder that had a bunch of pamphlets of all the different types of activities they were engaged in. We're going to talk about some of these, but just to give you a sense, Congress, Speakers Bureau, Bar and bat mitzvah twinnings. They took the movement into synagogues. We'll talk about that. Project Safer, Project Rescue. They were bringing books to the Soviet Union. Education, demonstrations and protests. Former refuseniks toured the USA. They were organizing all these things. They were doing a lot. The movement had some basic challenges. There's no internet. It's the Cold War. The Soviet Union is largely a closed society. They try not to let information get in or get out. It's porous. You can get information in, you can get information out, but you're going to have to jump over a lot of hurdles, go through a lot of hoops. It's far away. It's not a telegenic problem. How do you see it? How do you televise a glass ceiling? Right? The visuals are not there. And even if you have the visuals, it's hard to get them out, right? Because it's a closed society. So the problem is far away. It is invisible, and we're average American citizens trying to change the policy of a superpower during the rival superpower during the Cold War. How are we going to do that, right? Think about now, if you're in the States, you're trying to mobilize, for the Uyghur in China, okay? Who knows how American-Chinese relations are going to go? How long are you going to have to do this? You're going to have any chance of success? If you try, are you going to make the situation worse? Is it going to mess up US-Chinese relations? All these types of questions were live questions for the activists. How are you going to sustain this? Because if you don't know that you're actually going to be able to change the policy, maybe people are going to get tired and give up. But you can't give up because you know that people's lives are at stake. So how are you going to sustain it? That's the challenge. So they have a strategy. And the strategy is that they are going to make this a cultural movement. They are going to mobilize everything, everywhere, as much as they can. And they didn't frame it this way. I'm going to frame it this way because I think for those who are familiar with Jewish liturgy, it will make this more memorable. And for those who are not familiar with Jewish liturgy, this is basic Jewish liturgy, and you'll learn something about that. It's called Shema, and it's the basic Jewish affirmation of faith. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. But right after that, there's a paragraph that's read. And the paragraph says, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, and you shall, I have to translate it from the Hebrew. Help me with this. And upon your gaze, teach them diligently to your children when thou walkest by the way, and when thou sittest in thy house, and when thou liest down and rise. No matter where you are or what you're doing, you're meditating on this, you're doing this. Okay? Activists basically took this type of an approach. Thou shalt teach them diligently to thy children. They wanted to engage the Jewish community. And when they engaged the Jewish community, they didn't just go to adults. They said kids are people too. I think it was the 70s or 80s, kids are people too. Anyone remember this? Yeah. They mobilized children. Part of it was, if this is a Jewish value to speak out for Jews in need, how can you not put this as part of your Jewish education? Right? But the movement, which begins in the early 60s, and it begins, one of the first organizations, is Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry. So they're thinking about students all the way from the beginning, but it's only in the early 70s that they begin to think, oh yes, students are not just high school students, not just college students, it actually includes elementary school. And they created ways of getting elementary schoolers involved. This is the first handbook for children. It was produced in Washington, D.C., the Washington Committee for Soviet Jewry. There was a girl named Natasha Korenfeld who was, she had a nervous breakdown from, her family refused it. She ends up in the hospital with a mental break. And she writes a poem. The poem is her dream of going to Israel. Through a phone call with some people, I think in Arizona, the poem gets published in the West, in the States, in the Jerusalem Post, translated to English. And then Natasha starts getting letters from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, telling her to keep her mouth shut, and why would you want to go to Israel? We're going to kill you there, and your parents too. But there was something about the way that it was written that the parents said, this is not from the PFLP, even though it was postmarked from London. This is KGB, this is local, but it's the KGB harassing our daughter. This poem then gets published. It becomes basically the centerpiece for the children's mobilization, where they created a pen pal program between American Jewish kids and Soviet Jewish kids about the same age. And this is how it begins, early 1970s, but I think we have to get kids involved. Okay, so flash forward to 1983, and the way that children are getting involved in this movement is expanding in lots of different directions. And one of the ways is through art. It's a common thing. You do art projects in school and the like. Marilyn Tallman, Harriet Wolfstadt, and Pamela Cohen are signed here at the bottom. The co-chairman of the Chicago Action for Soviet Jewry and the chairman of the I Want to Be Free poster contest. So Chicago Action partners with Bank Leumi, which has a branch downtown, and they are going to do a poster contest where the kids will be asked to draw posters, draw art on the theme of Soviet Jewry, I Want to Be Free. The art will be displayed downtown at the Bank Leumi, so you're walking, I forget which street it's on, those of you who know where it is will know, like it's prominent enough, right? Okay, and it's nice, your kids' art is going to be displayed and the like. So we have a winner. The winner is Annie Fishbein from Akiba Schechter, 7th grader. Her drawing, Let Jews Be Free to Be Jews, up in the top right there. She herself had just emigrated from the Soviet Union and came to Chicago. Okay, so this is where, they're engaging kids, but the movement actually is succeeding because the Soviets are changing their policy, and all of a sudden, among the kids who they're engaging are kids who themselves are immigrants, who are also now becoming American Jewish activists for Soviet Jewry. And then you have the other kids here. I'll read the names in case anyone knows. Michelle Kallick, Harry Berkowitz, and Rebecca Oster. Anyone? Okay. But this was it. This was the poster contest, and this was Michelle Kallick. She was in 1st grade. Let me be free. Michelle, and I don't know which Natasha, I'm presuming that it was the Natasha of Natasha's Dream, because that book that was created in '75 goes through something like 16 editions. Kids, when they're getting bat mitzvahed, are quoting Natasha's poem from the pulpit, along with quoting Anne Frank at the same time. There is so much to teach about this that groups start developing curricula. And they're taking the movement into the Hebrew schools, into the summer camps, into the Jewish day schools. Full curricula they had planning grids. If it's Hanukkah and you want to do something about prayer, do this. If it's Lag BaOmer and you want to do something about freedom fighters, do that. So this Let My People Go curriculum, Chicago Action for Soviet Jewry. And then, of course, there was, and I saw a lot of heads nodding, this was the coup de grace. It was bar and bat mitzvah twinning. And to appreciate what this meant, the pen pals from Natasha's Dream eventually, after 75, about 4 years later, people realized, you know what, we can pen pal at a moment which is Jewishly significant for kids. We'll do this at their coming of age ceremony. But if anyone's served on a synagogue board, and you might know, synagogue, planning bar and bat mitzvahs, it's a major thing for the synagogues. So you have to balance, it's a regular Sabbath for the congregation, but it's a special event for the family. Okay, and now you have an outside group that's coming in and saying, and now we also want this time, we want you to devote this time for activism for our cause. And the fact that they were able to do this is really, it's an incredible thing when you think about it like that. The way that the ceremony would work, the kids in the Jewish kids in the Soviet Union were very, very difficult, unlikely that they were going to have bar bat mitzvahs. Bar mitzvah is unlikely. Bat mitzvah is impossible because the only synagogues that were functioning were Orthodox synagogues, and if you were a girl, you were not going to get bat mitzvah in an Orthodox synagogue in the Soviet Union. But Americans didn't really think about that aspect of it. Be that as it may. The idea was at the moment that the high point of the ritual, the Torah service, this is the moment when the kid becomes an adult. You've done the pen paling, you're called to the Torah, and the Soviet twin is called to the Torah. And you see those seats there that no one's sitting in? Those seats are reserved for the Soviet twin in the family. And the rabbi will call Ya'amod, rise to the Torah, the name of the Soviet child, who does not come. Ya'amod, rise to the Torah. And the silence was the point. And then the American kid steps in and says the prayers on behalf of the Soviet Jew who was unable to be with us. That was the idea. And then would stand up and give a sermon and explain, today I'm a man, and this is, as a Jewish adult, I take responsibility. I took responsibility by twinning my bar mitzvah, and the implication is, and Jewish adults, what are you doing? Right? And so the Jewish adults would, either they would feel guilty or they would fell with pride. Look at what a good Jewish kid we've raised who knows to take responsibility. And this was the high point. When thou sittest in thy house, when you're sitting at home, the rituals were not just synagogue rituals. They really did engage Jewish religion. They tried to engage Jews in moments when they were thinking and doing Jewish things. Passover, let my people go. It seems like it's an obvious moment to raise awareness, activism for Soviet Jews, and one of the nowadays, like right before Passover, you get mailings from all these different organizations that will say, put a lock on the Seder plate for the incarcerated or for different causes. A lot of that traces back to the ways in which the Soviet Jewry movement in the 1960s popularized a ritual of an extra matzah, the matzah of hope, a fourth matzah. This matzah, which we set aside as a symbol of hope for 3 million Jews of the Soviet Union, reminds us that as we observe this festival of freedom, we know that Soviet Jews are not free to learn of their Jewish past, not free to hand it down to their children. One of the interesting things, this is the earliest version of the text. Actually, this is the second earliest. The first version was called the Matzah of Oppression, but then they rebranded it because they wanted hope. It does not say that Soviet Jews were not free to leave. This is Passover. It's the festival of Exodus. And you're not saying, let my people go. At the time, American Jews were not aware that there were Jews in the Soviet Union who were raising their voices saying, let us out. This is 66, 67. It was 66, actually. Israel and the Soviet Union had diplomatic relations. Israel did not want to call for emigration at that time. It was not trying to destabilize the Soviet government. You start letting one group out, if you let the Jews out, you might stir up Ukrainian nationalism. That could bring the Soviet Union down. And so the Israelis were reticent for calling for emigration, and American Jews were, this is from the conference, the establishment, we're not going to touch it. A few years later, it's in there, and it's the first thing on the list. They're not free to leave when you're sitting in your house. When you're sitting in your house and it's not Passover, you might want to go to the fridge and get a drink, and you have a choice, especially in the 1980s, you had a choice. You could choose Pepsi, right, with, was that Michael Jackson? Or you could choose Coke with, I think, Elton John. But it was the Cola Wars. But even before the Cola Wars happened, like in the 80s, Jews were making choices between Coke and Pepsi in the States, and the idea was they were not going to choose Pepsi. And the reason was, it goes back to Nixon and détente, Pepsi was the very first American commercial product that was produced, marketed, sold in the Soviet Union. And the way that it was funded was Soviet vodkas and spirits that were being sold here. Whatever amount was sold in the States, that's how much profit Pepsi could make in the Soviet Union. So the Soviet government was essentially getting a cut of the profits. And for Soviet Jewry activists here, like, absolutely not. No détente on the backs of Jews no détente, without human rights. And so to give the people the opportunity to make a choice, a moral choice about Soviet Jewry, even in something as mundane as what soda are you going to drink, they started a Pepsi boycott. These are the minutes of meeting 73 with Pepsi Cola officials from Chicago. And you had here Rabbi William Gold, Rabbi Mordechai Simon, Laurel Pollack, Claire Mazur, Donald Kahan, and Saul Silverstein. Some of the names might be familiar to some of you. They met with the PR head of Pepsi at the time. His name was Deke DeLoach. Does that name ring a bell for anyone? Deke DeLoach? He was the number 3 of the FBI. Was under J. Edgar Hoover. And he was, with Hoover, he was like a liaison between Hoover and Lyndon Johnson. He did some stuff against the Klan, but he also was doing stuff against Martin Luther King at the same time. This is Deke DeLoach. He's working for Pepsi, and he's telling Chicago's Jewish leadership, yeah, we're not changing our policy. What the Soviets do with their Jewish population is an internal matter, and Pepsi is in the business of business. We're here to make a profit, and we're not getting involved in their internal affairs. Thank you very much. When thou walkest by the way. Those who were alive in the 1970s might remember it for a fad. It was a real passing fad. It was only going to happen for a little bit, and then it was going to be done. People would get tired of it. It was the fitness fad. This is the 1980s. You can tell it's the 80s because of the socks and how high they're pulled up. Also, it says 1983 on there. But in the 1970s, running, jogging becomes a thing. And activists are right on it. If people are jogging, that also is a moment that you can get them engaged in doing something for Soviet Jewry. And it was not just that, okay, nowadays there are the runs for everything. That was happening then too. But there was a little bit more than that. This is Joel Sandberg. You might have heard of his daughter, Shaul Sandberg. He's in South Florida. He's a leader of the Soviet Jewry Council there. He's wearing a T-shirt that was given to him by a dentist from Elkins Park, right outside of Philly, named Bernie Dishler. They were both runners. They were early adopters of running. They go to a Union of Councils national meeting in 77, I think. 78, probably 78. And they say, they go out for a run before the meeting starts. They're the only runners. Everyone else is still asleep or they're at the buffet table, but they're jogging. And as they're jogging, they're talking about their friend. And their friend is named Yuli Kosharovsky. And as it turns out, this thing that we think of as a very American fad, jogging, they were also doing it in the Soviet Union. Who knew? And Yuli Kosharovsky was a runner. And among the things that they would deliver to Yuli Kosharovsky when they would go were running shoes. So they're talking about him. They're telling a story. When I was there, Yuli was telling me that he was arrested right after a run. They didn't even let him shower. He's sweaty. They just throw him in a cold prison cell. Can you imagine what it was like? This is horrible. Well, you know what? And Dishler says to Sandberg, we had a run, we had a 10K in Philly. I made a T-shirt, and I said, I'm running for Yuli Kosharovsky. Sandberg says, it's a great idea. He, in the Hanukkah run in Miami, enters Kosharovsky into the race, and then he publicizes it. Okay, he's now invited Kosharovsky to come. Will the Soviet government allow Yuli Kosharovsky to leave the country to run in the special Hanukkah? I think it was an 8K. It's Hanukkah. He has Bernie's T-shirt. Of course, Yuli Kosharovsky doesn't come, but they get the publicity for it. And it's from this, 78, you get the very first Soviet Jewry run, and it's a run for Yuli Kosharovsky in LA the year later. And then, after that, these runs go everywhere, including Chicago, often with the same logo. Yuli Kosharovsky drops out. He comes back because he ends up, he's refusing for something like 18 years, the longest time in refusal of any of the refuseniks. He comes out, he goes to Philly, and he runs. And he runs with Bernie Dishler, and Dishler is wearing the shirt, but he changes it. Now it's I'm running with Yuli Kosharovsky, And his shirt says, "I am Yulia Kosharovsky." Student struggle for Soviet Jewry. They combined jogging. Pepsi was a major sponsor of races. They combined the Pepsi boycott with the running. You'll notice, did anyone read the Hebrew shirt? You don't even need to read Hebrew to recognize that logo on the shirts. It is not Pepsi Cola. Yeah, so that was their message. And then, of course, there was travel. They brought the shoes to Yulia Kosharovsky. We go back to Holly Birnbaum. Israel had begun sending tourists to make contact with Soviet Jews to deliver support after the Soviet Union essentially broke diplomatic ties, because at that point they couldn't use people who they had undercover in the embassy. So they started relying on people in the West. And one of the very first people that they sent from the States was Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt. She was a graduate student at Brandeis at the time, and she writes about it. And if anyone remembers or has read or can go out and find the Jewish catalog, it was essentially a whole earth catalog for the Jewish counterculture. There's a chapter on travel to the Soviet Union written by one Debbie Lipstadt, and she wrote it using all the stuff that she learned from the briefings that the Israelis gave her. As more Americans start going, other Americans hear about this, and they're saying to their Soviet Jewry groups, "Oh, we're interested. We want to do this. We want to go too." And in the Union of Councils, they're bristling because the Israelis are controlling information about the refuseniks. And they say, "We need an independent line of information on our own. We're just going to send our own people." And so they begin to create travel programs with briefings and debriefings. And you'll see here this guidebook for contacting Jews in the Soviet Union. This is a group called the Insiders Club. Okay, this was written by Herb Beller, who's sitting right there. And I have a chapter basically about this and about the work that he did. This is based in Washington, D.C. It was a grassroots establishment collaboration, and it solved the problem that made all of the travel, made getting the running shoes to Yulia Kosharovsky possible. It made the Holly Birnbaum's travel possible. The issue was this: you had all these people coming and saying, "Hey, I want to go, I want to go, I want to go," but the activist groups didn't really need people. They didn't need random people going and bothering the refuseniks, but you didn't want to turn people away. If they're saying they want to go and they want to help, you've got to find ways to let them help. Okay? But on the other hand, you had people who were deeply involved in the movement, who had been on phone calls with the leadership of the refusnik groups, and so you needed to essentially connect the activist leaders here with the activist leaders in the Soviet Union, and still find a way to allow the walk-ins to participate, to help, and maybe to get inspired, because a lot of people who went ended up becoming very, very involved. And what the Insiders Club did is it found ways essentially of dividing up the briefings and the missions to different categories of travelers. And it essentially solved the problem that for years before the activists were trying to organize this, were trying to do. Okay? So let me begin to wrap up. Yeah. We're going to move here. Okay. This is the number of immigrants from the Soviet Union, Jewish immigrants from the Soviet Union, from 1967 all the way through to 95. Soviet Union collapses here in 91. Okay? You'll see that even before the Soviet Union dissolves, there's already the gates are opened. But you'll also notice that the gates open in the 1970s and they close again in the 80s. What's going on? Activists didn't think that they could pressure the Soviet government to change. What they thought they could do was they could get the Soviet government to factor in Soviet Jewry into their decision-making calculus and bigger Cold War issues. And so you'll notice, first, the movement begins as a movement in the States in '63. There's nothing happening. Détente. All of a sudden, the Soviet government decides it wants better relations with the US, and the US decides it wants better relations with the Soviet government. And even though Nixon was not on board with this, and Kissinger, by the way, was not on board with this, the epigraph of this book is, I'll read the quote, this is Kissinger. The emigration of Jews from the Soviet Union is not an objective of American foreign policy. And if they put Jews into gas chambers in the Soviet Union, it is not an American concern. That's Henry Kissinger to Nixon in the White House on the tapes, March of '73. Okay? What this movement did is it basically got both the US government and the Soviet government to have to deal with it. And so letting Jews emigrate was a way that the Soviets were able to signal to the West that it wanted good relations. But what happens here? Brezhnev dies. You get a succession of leaders that die very quickly. Andropov, Chernenko, early Gorbachev, who's not doing glasnost yet. The Cold War chills. Reagan comes in, evil empire. They're real chilling in the Cold War. There's no incentive to play nice, and they close the gates. But glasnost, openness, the relations begin to warm. We start negotiating nuclear arms reduction, not limitation, but reduction treaties. And it goes up. And then things cascade. So the movement managed to get the Soviet government to factor this into their decision making, and they essentially turned the emigration of Soviet Jews into a symbol that the Kremlin could use to signal if it wanted good relations with the West. And it was an effective way of actually getting about 500,000 people out first and then a million more afterwards. So I'm going to end here, and we'll open to questions and to stories and the like. Thank you. I think are there mics? There are going to be mics that are going to go around.
I work for the American Dental Association, and I work with Bernie Dishler in Philadelphia. He was a very active member.
Okay. Did he tell you these stories?
No, he told dental stories.
Okay. So did he tell any stories about this?
No.
These are, the people who did this stuff are heroes, and they're not necessarily singing their own praises.
He was very active
Yeah.
in the dental one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, I'm a child of refuseniks myself, and I was reading this really long book from Brandeis University about the history of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment.
Yeah.
And it seems like there were quite a lot of arguments about whether it was a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah.
Obviously, Henry Kissinger thought it was a bad thing, and other Jews thought it was a bad thing, but more Jews thought it was a good thing. What do you think? Was it a good thing?
Okay, so Jackson-Vanik Amendment, early 1970s, it's the major policy objective that American activists have. How to pressure the American government. Well, the American government is not a singular unitary actor. It turns out Nixon wanted détente, and that actually gave some leverage. And it gave leverage to it gave leverage to people in Congress who were not as keen on a détente without change in the human rights policy. Among them was a senator from Washington State, Henry Jackson, Scoop Jackson. Okay, and there was a congressman from Cleveland, Charles Mills. He's from the very district where that book club in Cleveland that created the first Soviet Jewry group. It was that district because he had a local interest in this, and they put together it was a bipartisan bill that had basically wall-to-wall support in the Congress to tie most favored nation trade status, so improved economic relations with the Soviet Union, to make that dependent on the Soviets changing their immigration policy to not restrict immigration. Okay, and it was years and years of organization and activism. It was the major policy. All the stuff I was talking about had nothing to do with policy here, right? So twinning, not drinking Pepsi, all that's about getting American Jews involved. But the point was, you're doing this to do policy. This was the policy. Okay, so while the legislation was pending, and it was always a threat, the Soviets were letting people out. And they were letting people out in part because they wanted to ensure that they would get most favored nation trade status. They did not want to see this bill passed. Henry Jackson he ran for president in '76. He was a neoconservative Democrat who was trying to outflank Nixon from the right. That Nixon was soft on communism, and Jackson was going to hold that space. The legislation passes. Watergate happens. The legislation passes. Ford signs it into law. But there's another congressman. It's Adlai Stevenson III, who puts on a little rider at the end that limits the amount of funding of money that the Soviets could actually get out of the most favored nation stuff to some pittance that made it not worth their while. And at that point, they didn't fully close the gates, but they dramatically. I'll go back to I'll show you. Right? This is Jackson-Vanik is pending, and Jackson-Vanik passes. Okay, so the debate is, was it worth it? And there are two camps. One camp says, well, look, you were doing much better before you passed it. Once you passed the legislation, you basically, you played the card, you didn't have the leverage anymore, and the Soviets responded. Not how you wanted. You didn't think it through. Okay. That's one argument. The other argument is that law remained on the books. It actually remained on the books, I got it over here, all the way, it was replaced by the Magnitsky Act. Okay, so not that long ago, like long after the Soviet Union, it was still on the books. But it essentially provided a mechanism here in the 1980s that was still creating pressure on the Soviet government. And so I'm in the latter camp. I think the longer view it was effective, but short term was counterproductive. It would have been, if they were able to just keep it as a threat the whole time, they might have been able to keep these numbers even higher.
As we know, particularly recently, allowing immigration into the United States is currently an issue, but it's actually an issue that has been an issue in American politics for a very long time. So the red says to U.S. and elsewhere.
Yeah.
I assume that most of the non-Israelis did come to the United States. Was there something done to accommodate large numbers of Soviet Jewish immigrants to the United States? Was this a temporary thing, or
No.
and how was that accomplished?
So at some point, I think it was 72, it might have been 73, there was the activists managed to get a change in American policy to accept Soviet Jews on a type of status that made it much less paperwork for them and much easier to get in. And that happened here. So that was also part of what they were trying to do. Let my people go, but if they didn't have a place to go, so it was not just about let them go, it was also let them in. And so there was some work that was done here to get executive changes, didn't have to go through Congress or the like, to make it easier for the US to accept Soviet Jews in and to come in with refugee benefits, okay? But there were negotiations in the 70s and then certainly here in the late 80s where the Jewish communities and their social service agencies would be footing a major part of the bill for the resettlement efforts. So they were essentially designated agencies that the federal government would say, all right, you're responsible for this. It was I don't know that the American Jewish community works like this now. It was able to, there's a moment in history where it was able to work like this, where the national organizations were able to say, Chicago, you're going to take this number of Soviet Jews, and Nashville, where I'm from, you're going to take that number of Soviet Jews, and you're responsible for the funding. And the communities came together, and they essentially agreed to this deal, and so there was local resettlement. What happens here, part of what happens, you'll see the big shift, okay, where for the most part, the earliest immigrants are saying, we want to go to Israel. They're the ones who are the early adopters, the ones who are first taking the risk. Other Soviet Jews have been realizing, oh, this fifth line that was, that was a glass ceiling, well, this now might be the ticket out. And they're not as committed to going to Israel, and they now have another option. So you'll see, all of a sudden, the number that's going to the States, mostly the States, also Canada, Germany, other places, is going up, and to Israel less. And that happens again. Israel and the Soviet Union reestablished diplomatic relations. You get direct flights from Moscow to Tel Aviv. So here they would leave the Soviet Union, they'd go to Europe, and in Europe they could choose, are they going to continue on to Israel, or they want to go somewhere else. They could only get out, the fiction was, you're not getting out because you have a right to emigrate. You're getting out because you're going for national repatriation to your homeland. Okay? That way it's not going to apply to all the other Soviet nationalities, and it won't destabilize things. Okay? This is a special case for Jews who are going to go to their homeland. Okay? But once out in Europe, people could decide where they want to go. The Israelis are going ballistic at this point when they're seeing this. They're saying they should be, we need them, and the like. There's a big fight between American Jews and Israelis about this. But basically what happens here, the Israeli government, the Soviet government, and the American government all agree, steer the immigration to Israel. And Soviet Jews and American Jews are left. That's not what they wanted. They wanted freedom of choice. But the governments made the decision. It was better for them. And part of the decision here was there were refugees from Haiti, the refugees from other places. Why are we giving all these benefits to Soviet Jewish emigres? We have black immigrants from Haiti who are coming in. We're not giving them the same benefits. We have from Vietnam as well. So there were internal, domestic, sometimes race-related conflicts over which immigrants are we going to take and not take. And so Israel's willing to take them, go there. And that's what happened in the 90s.
Hi. So my father was one of the Chicago Jewish Federation members who went on one of these trips. I just had to text my mother, January of '86.
Okay, what was his name?
Eddie Fox.
Okay.
This is the first I've heard of it spoken publicly like this in my whole life. I didn't even talk to my family about it till tonight at dinner, because it just never dawned on me. Mm-hmm. I remember it very clearly. I was a month shy of being 17. How did you even know to dig all this up and create this if it's not widely taught and disseminated, except for those of us who lived it?
It became a passion project, so I just dug and dug and dug. That was part of it. But some of these things are now public record, and it is very possible that if you search in your father's name and add American Jewish Historical Society or Soviet Jewry, that if he wrote a report of his trip, that it might actually be online in the archive of the American Jewish Historical Society. There are about, I think, 2,600 trip reports from American travelers that are there and available. And so I worked with the AJHS to get access to the records, created a database, like went to read hundreds of them, and coded them. So I found the right archive, and I wanted this information, so I knew it was there. This project unfolded in phases, and I started by studying that Matzah of Hope. There were, in addition to that, there were Freedom Seders. They turned the Passover Seder into a public protest. They would go outside, some of you might have done this, outside a Soviet consulate, Soviet UN mission, Soviet embassy, and the Seder, it's usually done in a home or in a synagogue or in a community center. Now it's on the street, and then at the end, the matzah is getting thrown or slid onto the Soviet porch of the embassy, which is like you're using the matzah to invade Soviet territory. Right? And so I was studying that and how the student groups were doing that. And then as the project evolved, I began to focus more on how they were engaging in different aspects of culture. So I started with religion, and then I realized that a lot of the stuff they were doing had nothing to do with, it was not religion. It was Pepsi. It was, it was jogging. It was the fitness fad. It was travel. And I studied, Professor Shivitz had mentioned, I studied Birthright Israel. So I was interested in travel and tourism as a way that Jews engage with the world, that Jews engage with other Jewish communities. So that was for me, it was a natural fit. So American Jews go to Israel to build connections there. They were going to the Soviet Union to build connections with Soviet Jews, and that's what sort of led me to that.
We have one over here that's been up for a minute.
Thank you. Well, I'm one of these Russian Jews who lived the story from other side, so I want to say thank you. And I had the whole family of Klutznicks, which really suffered psychologically and everything else. I want to mention one other thing, the value of radio.
Louder, please.
I'm sorry, the American radio,
Yeah.
how much service it did for Russian Jews of getting information in. It was incredible. I just want to mention, maybe add to your research, but thank you.
Yeah, with Voice of America. And that
Voice of
there's a
America, yeah.
whole story there that I did not research, and I don't know who has, but it's an important part. And right, it's been cut, but it's been an important, very much important piece.
Yeah, it is very important. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, two more.
Hi, I'm from Montreal, and I remember participating in what they call the Simchat Torah rally. It was always held on the Sunday following Simchat Torah. I think it was initially started by students, but it was really large and quite a walk around downtown, ending, as you're saying, in what had been the Russian, I don't know if it was a trade commission or consulate, et cetera, and in a young and passionate Erwin Kotler, who was, later was involved in Frank Sharansky. So I wonder, was that another typical thing, was the Simchat Torah rally? And second thing I remember is really from the refuseniks who were let out would come to speak frequently in synagogues all over Canada, and if that was part of the U.S. experience, and how in general the Canadian experience compared to the U.S. one.
Yeah. One of the things in the brochure was refusenik tours, so that was happening. When people would get out, they would travel, and you get out and you're helping other people get out. The Simchat Torah we talk about Simchat Torah now, it's after October 7th, it has a different meaning. I want you to put yourself back in the mindset of Simchat Torah before 2023. Okay, this was a tiny, minor holiday. It's a holiday that is generally celebrated as a holiday for kids. It's at the end of the big holiday season, so a lot of people are holidayed out and they don't show up for it. Okay, in the Soviet Union, and Elie Wiesel writes about this in The Jews of Silence, which is a travelogue that becomes essentially, it's like this is the book that introduces the plight of Soviet Jews to a lot of Americans, a lot of Westerners, and he talks about Simchat Torah as a time in Moscow, in Leningrad, where Jews are going out and they're dancing outside the synagogue and affirming their Jewishness, like the one time in the year where people are being publicly Jewish. So this gets picked up and it's reported in the press year after year in the mid to late 60s, and the American groups who are going, they've already done stuff for Passover, they've done stuff for Hanukkah, they realize, oh, you know what? Simchat Torah. And no one's doing anything with Simchat Torah because it's a minor holiday. So they begin to organize massive dance rallies out in public. This is now a symbol of solidarity. If Soviet Jewish youth are out dancing in front of the synagogues, we will do the same. And Simchat Torah became an important holiday. Soviet Jew movement ends, and it drops off. Again, it goes back to what it had been, but this was the holiday of Jewish solidarity. And it's exactly that holiday that Hamas attacks on in 2023, right? So this was a holiday, it was about Jewish solidarity, Jewish strength, but Jews themselves basically forgot what this holiday meant, and then it got turned into a holiday of mourning. So some of the things that I've written outside of the book, you can Google it, it's probably somewhere online, but it's a piece about how in 2024, the importance for Jews of reclaiming Simchat Torah as a holiday of solidarity and pride, because that is essentially how it functioned for Jews in the Soviet Union and in the States and in Canada. Right here.
I worked for Jewish Family and Community Services in the late 80s and early 90s, and we had a huge Russian resettlement program. We had medical services. We made sure that people got whatever government services they were connected to. We had support groups, and we hired some of the earlier Russians who came to do some of the work with the newer Russians. It was really like 50% of what we did in those days was help with Russian resettlement.
Yeah. It was a major piece of Jewish family service work all over the country, and it was this moment in time. It was a wave, two waves: 1970s, the class of '79, and then again in the '80s. And if you look at the Jewish day school, the pictures on the walls of Jewish day schools, all of a sudden you see Russian names, and then they drop off. But that was a moment. It was a defining moment of what Jewish Family Services were doing. My wife directs Jewish Family Service in Nashville, and they're having their big fundraiser on Thursday. And one of the people who they're honoring, she's long passed, but she was the social worker director who ran the entire refugee resettlement program. Yeah. Annette Eskin.
So I think the sign of a successful talk is that there are many more people with their hands up who unfortunately we don't have time to get to for questions formally, but luckily we have some refreshments set up outside. I'm going to invite everybody to please join us for continuing the conversation there, and please join me in thanking for a really wonderful talk, Professor Shaul Kelner.
Thank you.